and supported by Google. And as part of this project, a network of think tanks and research institutes in several European countries in Ireland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Estonia are exploring what the concept of digital sovereignty means and what future it will herald for the EU, and particularly for small and open economies. The network held its first joint event in Dublin in July this year, and today's event is the second in a series of project events taking place in member state capitals, with the first event actually taking place on Tuesday in Stockholm on the Digital Markets Act, hosted by the Stockholm Free World Forum. And you can learn more about the project, and you can see earlier events and publications on www.iiea.com. And that brings me to the focus of today's webinar, which is the European Chips Act that was proposed by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in her State of the Union address in September. And as far as I understood, that was also the first time that most people heard about it. The broader context of the European Chips Act is, of course, already well known to most of us. It is the debate about European strategic autonomy or sovereignty, as we also heard French President Macron is his favorite way of putting it when he set out the French presidency conclusions yesterday. And what is motivated is this almost perfect storm of the COVID pandemic, America First rhetoric in the US, the remarkable rise of China as this technological superpower, which has made many Europeans suddenly very aware of the shortcomings of our more than 30-year approach to almost untamed supply chains. And one of the things that make me very excited about this focus on the Chips Act today is that it's one of the, to date, most concrete examples of how to put figures, how to put factory location discussions into this debate about strategic autonomy. But of course, the most exciting thing is our three distinguished speakers that we have with us today. We have Kim Jørgensen, Head of Cabinet of Commission Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, representing, so to say, the architects behind the European Chips Act. We have Thomas Bustrup, Deputy CEO of the Confederation of Danish Industries, representing the industry of a small open economy. And then we have Greg Slater, Vice President and Senior Director for Global Regulatory Affairs in Intel with us to give us also the perspectives from across the Atlantic. And I will proceed in this order of speakers and ask each speaker to give us a short introduction, and then we will follow in the end with possible questions also from you listening to the webinar. So please feel free to use the chat function on this Zoom call, and we'll try to read out questions during the discussion. But that's it for me in terms of introduction. I'd like to give the floor to you, Kim. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Katarina, and also looking forward to have the discussion with Thomas and Greg. As you said, this is a very, very topical issue. The current global shortages have exposed clearly the critical importance of semiconductors across a broad range of European industry, from automotive to healthcare. And I think it's also clearly that the shortage is slowing down the recovery of key economic sectors in Europe. As we all have seen, it has forced automakers around the EU to halt productions here at the end of the year. And I think it could also have effect on other sectors. And the shortage highlights the fragility of the semiconductor supply chain and the dependency of a limited number of companies and geographies in a tense geopolitical context. The supply chain largely relies on the US for general design and on Asia as a hub of semiconductor manufacturing. And this poses a risk to our global competitiveness and resilience. Furthermore, the dependency is also exacerbated by the extremely high barriers to entry and capital intensity of the sector, as well as its particularly relevance for existing and future security and defense applications. So we have all seen a lot of rumors also about and statements on the US and China already investing heavily in expanding their semiconductor capacity. We have seen it also in Japan, South Korea, and We have seen that large foreign companies are also taking a lead in the investment. They're also looking forward to hear you, Greg, but we have already seen that TSMC in Taiwan plans to spend around 100 billion US dollars over the next 3 years. And you are having plans around 80 billion, but you can come back to that. So it is, as you said, a very, very topical issue, and it is extremely important. But it's not a new thing that we are also talking about the supply chain of semiconductors at European level. We have had the key digital technologies joint undertaking founded by Horizon Europe, which focuses on research and development, and here we have also been looking at it. We have also funded around 1.8 billion euros from the European Union for this. We have also launched an industrial alliance on processors and semiconductor technologies that was launched, I think, in July this year. So it's not a new thing, so to say. And what we are doing with the alliance and other initiatives is to try to focus on the current gaps in production of microchips and the technology development needed for companies and organizations to drive, no matter their size. And we have also the Commission support member states in the process to set up IPCEI, the important project of common European interest of microelectronics, which is also, and where the aim is to bring together knowledge, expertise, financial resources, and economic actors from across the Union, where the aim is to deliver the key breakthrough technologies and critical infrastructures needed to address big societal changes where the market alone is unable to do it. And we have also streamlined our state aid rules to make it possible to help in this IPCEI process. So I think we have paid quite a lot of attention, and that's where the European Chips Act came up. So it's correct that it's a new sort of the term was done by the President in her State of the Union speech on the 15th of September. And this will not be a short-term initiative. We will need to work on this for a long-term focus. And I think the aim of the CHIPS Act, which have not been tabled yet, which we will table it in this first half of next year, I think we will have 3 dimensions: research and development and innovation, that's the first one, and then production as the second one, and international cooperation and partnership as the third dimension. I think it's extremely important also to folks to note that we have already a very successful research and development in Europe. We have some of the leading research and development companies on semiconductors in Europe. We have AMAC, we have Fraunhofer, we have CAA and Leti, and I think it's very important also to keep this and to develop a new generation of chips that can be produced in Europe. But it's also a key to accelerate the early adoption of innovative semiconductors technologies by the European industry. And I think it's also important to note, I mean, I think we have all, at least I have learned a lot on chips here in the Regions Month. Also, what is cutting edge chips, and we are not only need to produce the smallest chips, as I thought in the beginning, we definitely also need to produce so-called legacy chips, that the one we are using in a lot of the cars, and we are using in fridges and coffee machines. So we need to produce a wide range of chips. And I think nobody can produce everything themselves. As I said, the entry barriers financially is extremely high. And we also need to be able to make the chips productions also in a more energy efficient way. That's also a very important part of this. But as I said, we need to have a clear picture also of the bottlenecks in the semiconductor supply chains, in the different types of components for the main markets. It is necessary to anticipate possible future disruption and to ensure resilience of the entire supply chains. And we also need to make sure that if and where it makes sense, the production can take place in the EU as well. It will require massive public and private investment. As regards state aid, the Commission will consider approving support to fill possible funding gaps in the semiconductor ecosystem, in particularly for European first-of-a-kind facilities. And this assessment will be based on the EU treaty, which is what we always do if there are no state aid guidelines that can cover such measures. But what is also extremely important is that the objective of the CHIPS Act is not self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency in this area will remain an illusion, because nobody can do anything. And I think that was also when we had the Trade and Tech Council in Pittsburgh and ending of September with the US. I think this was also the very clear message that we received from the US side. And I'm just coming back from Washington, and I think it was also repeated in the meetings we had here in this week. And as I said, it's because the investments needed are so big and so huge that nobody can do everything together. And that's also why international partnerships will be extremely important. And that's why the US are working on their US CHIPS Act, which I think will be adopted either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. The European CHIPS Act will be adopted in the first half of next year. We have seen huge investment by Japan, huge investment by South Korea. And I think it's also fairly clear that what is needed is not a short-term supply chain problem, shortage of supply. I don't think we will be over it in a few months. We can also see that, for example, the numbers of chips in a normal car is around 500. I think in the electric car of tomorrow it will be 2,000 chips. So I think we need to establish a production of chips to be able to have a secure supply chains. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kim, very much for setting out the scene here, and also touching upon your own journey on learning about chips in the recent months. And and it's also fascinating to hear your reflections on the US possible cooperation coming back, having just been in the US, and also that this will be a key part of the CHIPS Act when we see it tabled next year. But it seems that now the focus is on getting the CHIPS Act going, but the lack of semiconductors in Europe and Europe's small role in this seems to be only just one symptom of a broader strategic dependency of Europe in a number of areas today. How much do you see the CHIPS Act as part of a broader change in the approach of Europe industrial policy to having maybe more of a state or public role in shaping what should be done and when? Do you have any comments on the broader debate that we are part of?
No, it's fairly clear that there's a broader context. I mean, we have seen, we had an updated industrial strategy we adopted last year. We have just adopted a communication on competition policy. I think it's extremely important that we are also seeing supply chains here. Competition is also what makes us resilient. Basically, so we also need to make sure that we are also focusing on the right areas, and I think it's also very important with the CHIPS Act. I think there is a particular problem and challenge in the supply chain of semiconductors, and that's why I think we will adopt the CHIPS Act. That's also why we will be ready. With all the things that we have when we give state aids, we will even go as far as allow to give state aids for production here. But I think this is because we feel that this is a particularly area. But it's also very important that we make sure that this happens in an open environment, so that we don't pour money into only 3 member states and close it for the rest, and that we don't ruin this excellent research and development environment we actually already have with for example, AMAC in Leuven in Belgium. And we also know that we have the ASML production of microchip machines in the Netherlands. So we actually have already a good starting point in Europe. But again, we have set the goal that we want to be able to produce 20% of all the microchips in 10 years time. Whether that's doable or not, I don't know, because in 10 years' times, the production will be most probably 4 times as much as today. So it's part of a broader picture, but I think it's very important that we also make sure that this happens in an open environment, and where the aim is to make sure that we have a secure supply chain. And a secure supply chain is not only one factory. That's the whole point. That it doesn't mean that we have to do everything in Europe, because when it comes to chips, that's not possible.
And do you think this balance on keeping the focus on where there are critical lacks in Europe is somehow, has it become more difficult to sustain after Brexit? Is there also some kind of, is this also part of the process of the EU having, so to say, lost one of its most free trade oriented members? Or is this simply this almost perfect storm I was setting out before about post-pandemic, post-America first, and so forth?
But the Americans are also saying that they cannot do everything on their own, and the UK will not be able to do everything on their own. I think we need to work together, but it's also clear that the balance on sort of free trade has already changed before Brexit, or it at least started. At least I've been working on these matters for quite some years, and I think it has shown that we can no longer depend on only one factory. But that doesn't mean that we have to bring home production in all areas to Europe, because I don't think that's the way to do it. We just have to diversify our supply chain. So it's correct that maybe the free trade balance has altered a bit with UK leaving the EU, but it would have changed anyway because of China and because of other things around in the globe.
Great. Thanks very much, Kim. We'll get back to you in the discussion part, but I think that is a very appropriate point for turning to Thomas Bustrup, Deputy CEO of the Confederation of Danish Industries. Because Thomas, what we hear often from the Danish industry point of view is how important it is to not throw all the values out on the European internal market, and how we have been used to doing things for many years, because it has really tremendously benefited, especially a small open economy such as the Danish. So I would be very curious to hear your perspectives on this, including how worried you are that this might be a lasting development towards more state aid and that kind of development in Europe. But over to you, Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Katarina. And also good to be with you, Kim and Greg. Looking forward to also the question and answers afterwards. You are 100% correctly in your introduction, Katarina, that coming from a business organization in a small open economy with a lot of members being extremely dependent on the internal market, this is something that we have our focus on. On the one side. On the other side, we just asked our members that are dependent on microchips, to what extent does this lack of microchips actually affect severely their turnover right now and their possibility of meeting the demands? And 75% of them said that there's a huge problem in this shortage of microchips that we're seeing right now. So this is truly a serious challenge for many of our members at the one side, and at the other side we need to safeguard some of the things that we have built up with the internal market and less state aid in Europe for many years. Just a few comments on what are they doing right now. How are they coping with this situation? Many of them are trying to diversify their supply chains, but of course, as this is a global problem, global challenge, this is not very easy. Some are trying to redesign their products so that they are less dependent on microchips, or that they are less dependent on certain microchips that they think are even tougher to get than others. So there's happening a lot in the research and development departments around in all the companies, and I think this is valid for all Europe. We actually have a discussion here in Denmark, or an issue. People are some companies are correctly connecting this to the pandemic, so they are also asking for compensation schemes. This is what we have seen during the pandemic, that restrictions on certain sectors and certain areas have led to the Danish government giving compensation schemes, and some of our members are now asking for the same. Of course, this is again a balance, because this is not this lack of microchips is not coming out of restrictions. It's simply coming out of the situation where demand and supply is in an imbalance. What have we done? We've tried to set up a group of companies together with some of the companies that we also have in Denmark that are supplying microchips, not because they are producing it, but because they are agents for some of the big microchips producers around in the world. This doesn't solve the problem, but at least it allows them to share best practices. It allows them to share experiences on how to handle this situation, this very, very difficult situation. Then you mentioned also the Microchip Act, and I mean, it really it makes sense in many ways. Also, as Kim just explained. Of course, it will not solve the acute shortage of microchips that we have right now. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look into the future, but it's very important to say that it's not something that will solve the situation right now. Probably you could say some of the existing producers are, I presume, and I have heard that they are investing already heavily in boosting their production capacities. This is not new production capacities, it's boosting the existing ones, and that will probably be ready earlier than if Europe were to set up new production capacities. So this is just to mention that there will be some kind of market correction to this, and the ones that will probably be able to solve the market situation quickly will probably be the producers, the factories that are already now producing microchips. So the CHIPS Act is also, and this is also what Kim mentioned, it's not only to solve the demand situation in the long run, it's also a strategic outlook. I mean, it is a way of securing that we will not get into the same situation that we are in now because of, you could say, strategic decisions made by other superpowers. Let's put it in that way. So we think that it makes sense. Of course, it's extremely important that we develop this production in Europe in the way that we think also solves the demand that European companies have in the future. I'm not a microchips expert, but as far as I understand it, that a lot of the demand from European producers are sort of less advanced microchips that you see in other products. So they should, of course, be put in very much into consideration when developing the CHIPS Act and implementing the CHIPS Act. Yes, just a little bit on the long-term political measures. Kim also mentioned this. Maybe the objective should not be to be sort of the global leader in advanced manufacturing of microchips, but it should be a position where we are at least in the game, and whether it's 20% or less or more, I don't know either. An ambition to be in the game without of sort of being the leader of it. Also, again, because I think other regions are really massively boosting their production right now. And from a market perspective, of course, so there's a risk of overcapacity, and then when you have overcapacity, it will lead to protectionism, and it could lead even to anti-dumping duties and stuff like that, and probably the production in Europe will, at the end of the day, not be fully competitive with productions taking place in Asia, for example. So to conclude, yes, European industry, Danish companies severely impacted at the moment by shortage of microchips. We need to try and find some short-term solutions to the problem, even though they are very difficult to find. And we also need, of course, to look at the long term, and also the security for European companies of having access to microchips in the future. Again, it's still very important that these solutions are tailored in the way that it is in line, you could say, with the overall ideas and of the internal market in Europe. Thanks. That would be my introduction.
Thank you very much, Thomas, also for pointing out, quite a dramatic figure you found in your study that 75%, if I heard you correct, of Danish companies today have some shortage of your members. But also the gap between the current shortage and then what's being proposed right now, it's two different. It's two different things we're talking about. But now that and I think I also heard, quite a backing from your side to the initiatives being taken right now to avoid such crisis in the future. But actually, Denmark is one of the few member states who have not set aside resources in the recovery fund after COVID for joining these IPCEIs that Kim spoke about, these important projects of common European interest, which are a way to give state aid to develop, to respond to any need, any dependencies. And also, we have not specifically any plans to join the microchip or the micro industry IPCEIs. Is that, Thomas, in your view, do we have to somehow realize that now this is the new Christmas tree and we need to put everything we can to decorate that, or do you think it is okay to somehow be one of the member states who are on the sidelines here, and even though others might move ahead on IPCEIs and other these projects, what would be your concerns from the industry perspective?
Well, I think it's a signal of the way that we look at state aid in Denmark. Both the government, the Danish government, but also they're dependent on our view on this, and we've discussed this with our members whether to join this or not. Despite the fact that so many of our members are actually lacking microchips right now, they don't feel that they are sort of part of the solution. They don't feel they have the competences and the knowledge and the background for actually being part of a project, a European project with state aid that they can contribute to. So I think their viewpoint, it's a bit idealistic, but it's not so far from the truth, is that, we should give the state aid to the companies in Europe that are best able actually to solve this problem in the future. And they don't think that they are among those companies. They are demanding the projects, the products, sorry, but they don't think that they are part of the solution of actually producing microchips in the future. I think that's a signal that the Danish business environment is giving here. We're backing up the project, but we think that there are companies in Europe that are more capable of actually solving this than the Danish companies. Then there are other projects on hydrogen, and where Danish business community to a very, very high extent is sort of putting themselves available to actually solve that on a European level, but not apparently not when it comes to production of microchips.
I think so. It is not just a bandwagon you have to jump on at any price or any cost. It is a question about the strengths in the country. But we here now there might also be a need on health issues. So
yes.
There might be many to consider in the near future. But I would thank you very much, Thomas, and also we will get back to discuss more in a little while. But we'll turn to Greg Slater. You are joining us, if I understood correctly, from California. So it's actually 3 a.m. if I understood correctly, maybe 3:30 right now. It's very impressive that you're with us. You're Vice President and Senior Director of Global Regulatory Affairs for Intel. We already heard about the US perspective from Kim, who just back from the States, about the Trade and Tech Council, and also Kim's Commissioner Margrethe Vestager in a recent speech talked very much about possible cooperation, quite concrete initiatives and proposals for cooperation on something like chips and how to make sure that the US Chips Act and the European Chips Act somehow speak together and promote the same values. I'm very keen to hear from you, Greg, what your perspective is on this discussion of a European Chips Act. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'll come back to that point about collaboration in a minute. So I'm actually in Arizona. California is 1 hour behind us, so it's 2:30 a.m. there. Arizona is where we have our largest manufacturing site, and that's where I'm based. But I've been to Ireland, of course, because we have a large operation there. But the short answer to the thought-provoking question for this panel is that the EU Chips Act will put the EU at the center of the next-gen semiconductor ecosystem if it is properly shaped and effectively implemented. And for me to watch both the development of the US and the EU Chips Act is fascinating because both we face the same problem, significant decline in manufacture of semiconductors, and the vulnerability to one small area of the world where nearly all our semiconductor supply comes from. And as you mentioned, Katarina, yesterday at an event in the US, EU Commissioner Vestager acknowledged the urgent need to increase semiconductor manufacturing capacity in the EU, as did Kim. EU Commissioner Breton also strongly supports this effort, labeling it as one of the 3 dimensions for a successful EU Chips Act. While these leaders have slightly different approaches, the important point is that they see common problems with our critical industry and share a common vision on how to fix them. At Intel, we're very supportive of the vision behind the EU Chips Act. It's a critical or crucial initiative by the EU to restore resilience in the EU supply chains. And second, we believe it should focus on stimulating capability as well as capacity because of the synergistic effects that happen between them that need to be captured to achieve technology leadership. The EU Chips Act will help the EU meet its 2030 digital targets by accelerating EU leadership in important areas like energy efficient data centers, communication infrastructure, and artificial intelligence. All resources should be mobilized, and the entire policy toolbox should be used my understanding is what it would be an overarching framework to set up, including a dedicated European semiconductor fund. As Kim said, and I believe Commissioner Vestager also said, the goal shouldn't be to be completely self-sufficient, because in their words, that's an illusion in our complex and highly specialized industry with a global supply chain. Rather, it should be to create strategic autonomy in the semiconductor supply chain where there are single points of failure that matter the most from an economic and national security perspective. We welcome the new competition rules that Kim mentioned. It is important to align the EU CHIPS Act with existing funding vehicles like IPCEI or IPCEI that was mentioned, which is a great tool, but it's not very well suited for a strategic private commercial production. And also to align the CHIPS Act with financial instruments like National Recovery Funds and Horizon Europe, while pursuing other needed solutions, like the dedicated funding to fill critical ecosystem gaps by supporting first-of-a-kind facilities that Kim mentioned. So we have 3 recommendations for a successful EU CHIPS Act. First, strengthen the world-class semiconductor research capabilities that already exist in the EU by creating a collaborative mechanism among your premier institutions like IMEC, Fraunhofer, and CA-Leti. One of the lessons learned so far in the new the new US CHIPS Act is that it sets up legislatively a number of R&D programs, but doesn't really tie them together to more effectively bring innovation from the lab to the fab. The US Commerce Department has asked the US Semiconductor Industry Association to do an inventory of the pre-competitive R&D that is being done by government programs and universities to help identify the gaps that should be addressed by the R&D programs that the US CHIPS Act will set up and fund. Maybe the European Semiconductor Alliance can do the same thing. Second, the EU CHIPS Act should support increased capacity, especially for leading edge technologies. Leading edge semiconductors are the building blocks for key emerging technologies such as AI, 5G, autonomous driving, photonics, and quantum computing. To be at the forefront of innovation and minimize supply chain disruptions, Europe needs to invest in both the design and manufacture of leading edge chips. And I think Kim mentioned this too. A recent Kearney report forecasts that the demand for leading edge semiconductors in Europe will grow at 15% CAGR through 2030, much faster than the growth of demand at lagging nodes, even though that's also important, as Kim mentioned. Leading edge design and chip manufacture, when they're located near each other, are much stronger together because of the synergistic effects that happen. And investing in both will fulfill the EU's goal of restoring tech leadership in our industry. So the EU needs to make investments to continue to protect current leadership in areas like R&D and tool making, but also make investments with the private sector where it needs to catch up, such as in advanced chip making. I think Kim already alluded to this. Building new leading edge fabs is not cheap. 17 billion euros for 2 fabs and 11 billion euros to operate those 2 fabs over a 10-year period. And we face these economic headwinds with the massive subsidies that are given elsewhere. And so there will need to be a private-public investment to close that cost gap. And the difficulty here is that technology continues to get more and more expensive. Right now, a 30% increase with each new generation. The last recommendation we have is that the EU CHIPS Act should promote collaboration. We're helpful to Europe's goals. And Kim already mentioned this, so I will just mention 2 possibilities here that the US CHIPS Act creates. That act has what's called a multilateral security fund, where with allies, the allies can share funds to develop collaborative research, pre-competitive research, and develop standards that help, like common export control standards or regulations. And so that's an interesting concept. In addition, the US CHIPS Act sets up the National Semiconductor Technology Center and allocates a fair amount of funding to that. I know the US Commerce, Intel is certainly supportive of the NSTC, National Semiconductor Technology Center, collaborating with IMEC, finding gaps in R&D and collaborating together so that it's less expensive to move R&D forward and develop leadership and sustainment in that important function. So those are just 2 examples of where the US and the EU could collaborate to address common problems. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg, for these very concrete recommendations for the European Chips Act. And I would love, obviously, to hear Kim's reactions. I think they fit very well into some of the three aspects, components of the Chips Act that you set out, Kim. Maybe not so much the production part of it, but the research and development and the cooperation ones. But I'll give the floor to you in a bit. But Greg, maybe just for everyone, I mean, when was the first time you heard of a European Chips Act, and what was your initial thought?
Well, at 3 a.m., I'm not sure my memory is great, but it was mid-September, and I'm not sure if it was President von der Leyen's announcement or if it was before then. And my reaction was, this is great. This is what they should be doing. And as I mentioned already, I think if it's properly shaped and effectively implemented, it will be a big success.
Great. Well, that's a nice way to hand over to Kim with this support from Greg in Intel. But Kim, can you maybe just, and I'll also just ask Thomas afterwards to just give a few maybe reactions also to the different speeches we've heard before we have some questions from the audience. But Kim, what would be your response to hearing this feedback on the Chips Act?
Thanks a lot, and I completely agree. But just again to repeat that just as I mean the US Chips Act, the European Chips Act, I mean it's a way to put the political focus on the shortage of supply for semiconductors, because we could actually do all the different elements in what is going to be the Chips Act. We could do that with different programs. Of course, we would need we can do state aid based on the treaty. We can do IPCEIs, and we can do research and development. We have a Horizon Europe program. We have Connectivity Europe program. But it's a way to say this is extremely important politically, and therefore we put it together. And I think it's very important that we do cooperate, as I said, with the US, but not only the US, with other like-minded partners, because we simply need to also work very closely with Japan, with South Korea, with other third countries. And as Greg rightly said, it's what the US are doing in research and development is basically to make a federal system where you connect all the different research institutes and companies, and we should do the same at European level. And it would also not be wise if we just duplicate each other. And I think in Europe we have really one of our leading, where we are leading, that is actually on research and development, and we should not ruin that by taking away customers or taking away part of what is the strength of for example, AMAC. And we should not just move AMAC or create a second AMAC in the US. We should cooperate. And I think that's very important. And of course, the money needed. I saw also one of the questions in the chat, how would be the expenditures between EU and member states. It's fairly clear that the EU budget, I mean, we can find money at Horizon Europe, we can find money in Connectivity Europe, but when it comes to the actual production, there the EU budget cannot. That will have to be member states that will have to go in with, and company and private capital, of course.
Great, thanks, Kim, also for highlighting the question. I think it was from Paul Dupia about the Chips Act, whether it in the balance between member state and EU funding. But Thomas, before we go back to the questions, your reflections and listening to Kim and to Greg here. I mean, how much are you convinced that this is a necessary long-term investment, or do you think that this transitory problem you were mentioning is something that's quite different from what we're engaging on with these much longer and much more committing plans? Do you have any reactions to what you've heard so far?
I think it's I mean, the world is changing, right? And raw materials in general, not only semiconductors, but world materials in general is going to be an even more important part of developing our economies and developing our businesses. So that we as a continent will need to look at how to ensure supplies of raw materials in general, hereby also semiconductors, is a natural step. And I think that especially also hearing Greg, even though it's 3 o'clock in the morning, Greg, it's very clear what you're saying, and I think it shows that a strong alliance between Europe and the US also in this is something that we need to develop. I mean, there are much better platforms for developing the transatlantic cooperation now than before, and I think this is one of the issues where we have to do it.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I will turn to a question now from a member of the audience here. Emil Drevsfeldt Nielsen asks, will the European Chips Act give birth to EU financial support to new production facilities in Europe, for instance, within the R&D capabilities, thus still aligning EU state aid rules? I wonder if that is mainly for Kim to consider. I can also just throw in another question from Seamus Allen. I think that's maybe mainly to Thomas. Thomas, do you think this current semiconductor, we actually touched a bit about that, is mostly a short-term transitory problem that will be resolved by itself in a number of years, even without the CHIPS Act? And also what other speakers thought about this. We heard a little bit about that already. And then for Greg Slater, what seems to be the differences and similarities in the approach and emphasis for a CHIPS Act in the EU and the US? So I hope that has given you a few inspiration for some future, some further discussion here. I think maybe let's turn to Greg and see if you want to start on some of this, Greg.
So I have not seen the EU CHIPS Act yet, but I'll base my comments on what I've heard, the announcements about it. And I think I will go back to something that Kim mentioned, that all the existing tools enable the European Commission to incentivize and help fill with private investment the supply chain gaps that they deem most important. I think one of the things I would say is time is of the essence. There is a sense of urgency here. Private companies that are investing in the semiconductor industry are usually public companies, most of them, except the startup R&D companies, and they're under tremendous competitive pressure because it's a very dynamic industry, and so decisions have to be made on where to invest. And so whether it's the US or the EU CHIPS Act, they have to be effective in their implementation. And maybe that's something that the EU CHIPS Act can do better than by tying all these pieces together that Kim mentioned in an effective way that complies with state aid restrictions. The EU CHIPS Act is it's a piece of legislation that is pretty high level in a lot of respects and will require rulemaking, and that will slow things down. Hopefully the EU CHIPS Act, again, I have not seen it, but hopefully it will maybe a mix of instruments, some of which will speed up the acceleration of the use of these tools that already exist, so that because decisions are being made right now on where to invest, and you can't take years to do that. So those are sort of some general comments. Similarities, there's a desire to collaborate, to do a realization that nobody can do it all. I already mentioned a couple of examples for that. Differences is in the US, you have a piece of legislation. In the EU, hopefully, maybe there's room to use already the existing toolbox in a more effective way.
Thanks. Could you just comment a bit on how the US, you think, will go about finding partners in terms of this, other than Europe?
Well, so the one fund, the Multilateral Security Fund, Katerina, talks about allies that have common export control views. That's pretty narrow, All right, that's pretty narrow. I wouldn't be surprised if under this the current administration that was broadened a little bit in terms of the criteria for finding allies to use multilateral funds to achieve common objectives. But that's all that's been discussed so far. And that's all that's in the legislation so far.
Great, thanks. Kim, can I turn to you also maybe with a comment on the ally partner ideas that you have in the Commission, and also maybe elaborate a little bit. There's another question in the audience about the shortage of raw materials for chips and how much that the plan itself, the CHIPS Act itself, might turn to proposals and solutions to address the raw material shortage. Kim.
I mean, the question of raw material, it's not going to be an item in itself, but that's also part of the international partnership, because what we also need is to map and to have some kind of what is it called, alert mechanism, that when we can see that in some months' times, if the current situation continues, then we will have a shortage of supply of lithium or some other raw materials, and what can we then do to see if we can find alternative places to buy some of the smaller items. So raw materials is certainly also a very important part of the whole thing. And then as Greg said, I completely agree that there is a sense of urgency, but at the same time, it's also correct what Thomas said, that in the current situation, there's not much you can do to help the current shortage of supply, because here you can only try to encourage and to get the companies that are already there to boost their production, because I mean, it takes time to build a new fab, and therefore, I mean, it's a bit complicated, and we also, when we are doing our CHIPS Acts, as I said, there are several chips, as I have now been learning. We have, in the beginning, I thought that the cutting edge, that was what everybody wanted, the smaller ones, the very small ones on 2 nanos, that even Apple are just trying to design a 3 nano one for their new iPhone. So they're not even down to 2 yet. But in where the strength of Europe is actually more in what we call legacy chips, and that we also need to produce. So we really need also to have, so a very important part of both the US CHIPS Act, but also the European CHIPS Act, is also to mapping the need, so that we don't pour in all the money in the wrong place, so to say. I think that's an extremely important part of the exercise. And I'm glad that Greg haven't seen the CHIPS Act yet, because I haven't seen it either. It's in the making.
And Thomas, what would be your biggest hope that would be in the CHIPS Act, and your biggest fear of what would be in it? And maybe also just comment on some of the other questions you've heard. Thomas, are you there?
Yeah, I think my biggest fear will be exactly what Kim just mentioned here. Is that we're putting up production in Europe of chips which are not in line with the demand of the European producers. So I think we need to be very clear on what it is that we need, and basically we have to try and be clear on what is it that we need in 5 years, because this is probably the time span that we're looking into. And you also mentioned another question before, Katharina, and I mean, I basically believe in the market, also in a global sense. So I think there will be long-term market corrections in the way that the supply will actually meet the demand, even though that the demand will continue to increase over the years. I mean, even more, we've seen a big increase in demand for microchips for the last 10 years, and that will just continue. But I still believe in that the market will make the corrections, and that the supply will be there. The thing is that most of the increase in the production that we've seen over the last 10 years have taken place in China, and I think it's just fair and to say directly that, you know, if we come into a situation like this, and most of the, or a huge part of the production will take place in China. We will meet probably export restrictions from China, and so they will say that you know, if everybody is lacking microchips, that then the Chinese companies should be first in line. I think that's probably what we're going to see, and this is why that this CHIPS Act, both in the US and in Europe, makes sense.
Thanks, and that brings me also to a question from the audience in terms of how much of the European CHIPS Act is actually motivated by China. So quite a direct question, and also a question from Seamus Allen from the IIEA. It seems to be directed mostly at you, Greg, but I think it's broader as well in terms to the cooperation between the US and the EU on the CHIPS Act. So he's asking what seems to be the differences and similarities in the approach and emphasis for a CHIPS Act in the US and the EU. And does all speakers, do you have perspectives on how we can ensure that these acts complement each other, or if there are any risks of regulatory contradiction and unnecessary duplication, and maybe even harmful state-backed competition between the EU and the US resulting as a consequence of this? So I think looking at the time, that will actually bring us to the final round of comments from the three of you. And I think we'll do the same order as we did the speeches in. So if you can perhaps please reflect on these questions and also make any concluding remark you might want to make, that would be great. Thanks, and over to you, Kim.
Yeah, I mean, the question on sort of the competition and the overlap, I think we've already touched upon this quite many times. It's clear that I think we want to do to make production in Europe, and it's also fairly clear that the US are already now building factories in Arizona, also where Intel are, and they want to do their own production. So there will be areas where I think we want to do the same, but I hope that we can also make sure that it will be not very wise if all of us were going to make exactly the same chip, and then we would not do all the other chips that is necessary for the business environment. So I think that's where the cooperation and coordination comes into place. And I think it's a very I mean, the reasons why we are having this discussion today, the reasons why the US are making their CHIPS Act, we're doing ours, is of course that we can all of us can see that it's not very healthy if all the world's production of microchips is taking place in the same place. We simply need to diversify the supply chain, and so yes, there is of course an element of China in this place, and what we have seen of Chinese behavior in other areas, and that's also why I think as an important part of the US CHIPS Act is also export control. That's also an area that's one of the themes for one of the 10 working groups in the Trade and Tech Council between the EU and the US. That's also one of the areas where we've been discussing export controls with the US and EU.
Great. Thomas?
Yeah, on the question on competition between CHIP Acts and US and EU, I mean, I think it's a very fair question. I mean, the thing is with microchips, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to set up the production. And this would also mean that if you have an overcapacity, then it will cost a lot of money to sort of slow down the production. So there is a risk of sort of this state aid production of CHIP Acts of microchips will sort of continue. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't go into it. It just means that we need to cooperate very well together, and I think especially between the US and Europe.
Excellent. And Greg, your final remarks?
Well, maybe I can build on those comments, given the shortness of time. I think one of the differences between the US and the EU is that the US is strong in design. The EU needs to be stronger in design. The US is not as strong in some areas of R&D as Europe. needs to strengthen that. But there's certainly ample room for collaboration and cooperation. Maybe the TTC can help there, and it definitely needs to happen. But I'm not so worried at this point about a race to the bottom from a subsidy perspective or a redundancy perspective, because the US and EU are so far behind, at least in the manufacturing area, that does, and it's so expensive to set up those factories, and we need so many of them that I think that's a problem, a challenge that we need to worry about down the road more than today. I would just refer again to the Kearney report that estimates that leading edge demand in EU will grow 15%, whereas lagging edge, as important as that is, it will grow about 3%. And the US CHIPS Act recognizes the same issue where it's funding lagging nodes, but only not a whole lot. It's more focused on other things. So I think there's some differences and similarities, and the TTC can actually help smooth those out and fill in and help collaborate, promote the spirit of collaboration.
Thank you, Greg. That gives me a positive note to conclude on as well. And I think we've heard from Kim Jørgensen, we've heard about the main components of a still unseen CHIPS Act, what it will focus on. We've heard from Thomas, the perspective of Danish industry, I think being pragmatic on this, being cautious, but also accommodating on the need for longer term resilience, but still also remembering that there is a current shortage, that this is completely a different story. We learned 3 concrete recommendations for what Europe should put in its CHIPS Act from across the Atlantic Ocean from you, Greg. And I think that has tied very well together in terms of trying to make more sense of the European CHIPS Act and what it's about. We know it's about tech sovereignty. That was the term under which it was presented by the Commission President. It's certainly not nice not to be sovereign. So I think the shared goal and the joint aims of this will certainly be something that we will continue to hear about in the coming months and years. I would like to thank everyone very much for their contributions. Thank you very much, Greg, especially I think waking up in the middle of the night and being able to talk about chips production and research and development and all of this. It's been fascinating to hear. Thank you, Thomas, for coming with the inputs from the small open economy. And thank you, Kim, for having turned up straight after your US journey to share your perspectives with us and set out